All right, starting another video here in my truck. Sorry for the audio disturbance there. Two reasons. One, my wife said my car was too loud and she'd click off my video. And if my wife is clicking off my video, then I know everyone else will click off my video. So anyway, that's part of it. I have an electric truck, so it should be quiet enough other than the AC. And so as I'm recording this, I actually don't have an idea what I want to fully express, but I think some of the things that are important. Oh, I didn't go over the second reason why I'm recording this video. The second reason is I want to drink. Obviously not alcohol, but I want to have a drink, and I don't drink in my car. So it's this Brazilian soda, Guaraná. In case y'all didn't know, I married a Brazilian. So anyway, she introduced me to this drink. It's pretty damn good. But moving on. So, it's an interesting thing. I got into a conversation on Discord today. I really enjoy the group intellect that's on there, despite maybe some of the antisocial tendencies that exist in Discord. But there is a place for it. I think it's really difficult in general to create good connection unless you're actively going out and living your social life, which I think is not as common as it used to be. I know a lot of people still do it, but one thing for me, it's hot as shit in Austin, 9 to 10 months a year. So it gets a little iffy to go out and do anything too much outside unless it's in the morning, which I like morning activity. But most social life happens after working hours, and it's super hot, hard. It's almost insufferable to deal with. So there's that. But anyway, I can't speak for everybody, but I think in general people are having a hard time connecting with each other, and I think that leads to a lot of disconnect with other people. And so anyway, I was on this Discord conversation, and this guy I was talking to he basically told me that I should pretty much just stop a conversation, primarily because I'll never understand why people carry grudges. And I think he had some merit in the sense that I probably won't fully understand. I do challenge it a lot because I don't really believe in it. I don't believe grudges. I feel personally that grudges are, and I think some research backs it up too, that grudges just carry negative sentiment for a long time. And this is why people preach forgiveness or these other things that they preach. And it's to get this negative energy out of your body. And there may be space somewhere in our lives that grudges hold some sense. But I suppose for me, what should be in lieu of grudges is a collective set of principles with justice at the end of that. So instead of the individual carrying a sense of I hate somebody or I want to exact vengeance on this person, to me that feels a little more immature. And it feels like you're not processing your emotions effectively. It feels more like you are burying your emotions and you're holding this negative sentiment. And I think that one of the big flaws with society today is emotional processing. And, there was a period of my life where, and I'm going to digress from this in a second, but there was a period in my life where I went numb because of how much went on and how much trauma I endured as a teenager. Some of that trauma was of my own doing, and I probably equally deserve that in the sense of justice. But the other trauma was something that I think was mostly out of my control. I probably played some role in that I'm not entirely aware of. But we got in this discussion, and, in that moment, I didn't know how to emotionally express. I was going to talk about the conversation, but I didn't. I didn't really know how to like express what I was feeling. And I think a lot of teenagers struggle with this, right? This is where the adolescent years are so complicated, from feelings of like love. It's so consuming. It's so possessing. It's so strong. It's so powerful. It's overwhelming. And you can't really distinguish lust and love even. It's like you're just having this confusion of shit that's going on, and you can't really make much sense of it. And I think this stems back to the formative years of learning how to emotionally process. My dad, in his defense, he really couldn't be present for me, or nor teach me how to emotionally process. He had his own slew of problems he was working through in my childhood, and my mom was working all the time, and I'm not even to this day aware of how well she emotionally processes. I spent some time with her a few months ago, and she seemed like she's hit this new like spiritual awareness that she knows how to process her emotions, but it took her until her 60s or 70s before she really learned how to do that. I think she struggled much earlier than that, in her 40s, 50s, at least when I spent some time with her. Or maybe my impression of the past is wrong. But I think this stems from the formative years. All right. So my point is, like, when I talk about a collective shared sense of culture, right, or a series of values that are shared amongst a principled culture, then you inflict or infringe on the rights of others, or you cause harm, or you damage others, then you already know the consequences, right? Whereas if you don't have these principles in place, then the consequences are up to the individual that you've crossed. Whereas if it's already pre-established, like most of the issues that I've run into in an organization, at least a corporate culture, which I think is very rules and principles based for the most part, which is great, is that in the communication, expectations aren't established up front. And I feel like this is what creates a lot of breakage in organizations, when expectations are not established up front. So going back to principles, the big piece of that is establish the expectation up front. If you don't do this, and here's the consequence. Well, in a personal grudge or in a vengeance quest, those are not established. It's, you've crossed me, and now it's up to me to individually determine what my own just sense of justice is for the crime that you've committed. The problem is this is very diluted with emotions, and if you're not able to process those emotions, the justice may be overdone. And maybe the revenge goes too far. Or maybe it perpetuates a sense of revenge on revenge on revenge, and it creates a perpetual cycle. I think the only argument against, at least what I can reason out of it, the only arguments that are really posed against a collective shared of ideals is who comes up with them, and how does that exactly mean that justice is tit for tat, right? Is it a life for a life, an eye for an eye? And obviously that sounds fair, but there's also a little more ambiguous situations. Like, for example, let's say that you're on your cell phone and you're driving and you hit a pedestrian. And we call that manslaughter, maybe negligence. What's the punishment for that? It's not the same degree as intentional murder, so should you die? Should you be executed? Anyway, I'm not going to discuss that because I don't have all the answers to that, but I think that's the question that comes down to what shared principles and values really matter, right? And who is establishing those, and who decides the sense of justice. I think the short answer is the community does, but I don't really believe in a democracy. Like, hey, everybody raise your hand, because that tribal or mob mentality can easily be influenced by a bunch of dumbasses that aren't reasoning through these things. I think the republic was the best way, was electing representatives, but that requires a sense of humility, because you've got to elect representatives that you think can better represent what you believe than yourself, which is kind of our decline in America, is we're not electing people that can even reason. They're also dumbasses. So It's just really difficult, and I think it's so multivariate. It's really hard to pinpoint without me really thinking through exactly what it is. But anyway, this guy on Discord claims that he said, I should stop at challenging it because I'll never understand it, which is probably true. But I try my best to understand and be empathetic toward people who carry such sentiment. I think where maybe the waters got muddied a little bit is he might carry a different semantic meaning on the word grudge. Whereas boundaries and grudges are two different things, right? Boundaries are absolutely necessary. You have to hold boundaries. And if those boundaries are crossed, you need to expel that person from your life. Of course, you can give them warning and say, here's the expectation. But if you set the expectation up front and it's crossed, then you have to exact justice. And that justice may be that you are no longer friends or whoever crosses that boundary, right? So there's a big difference between holding a grudge and having a boundary. And I don't see any need to carry a grudge. It serves no purpose past a boundary, right? You set a boundary, you expel that person from your life. Simple. It's a really simple concept. It's harder because sometimes there's really feelings involved, especially if it's a romantic or intimate relationship. It can get complicated, but still, we should hold firm in our boundaries, but we shouldn't carry that negative sentiment of a grudge. So those are two things that I think are really important. There's one more point I want to make, but those are two things that are really important. The third point I want to make is it's emotions, right? So in that moment, when your boundaries are crossed, the standard emotion, I can't say for everyone, but the standard emotion is anger. When someone's boundaries are crossed, the standard emotion is anger. And you're pissed. Somebody crossed your boundaries. It comes out as anger. And I think that's pretty much universal. There's very few people when their boundaries are crossed are like, I feel shame because my boundaries are crossed. Maybe there's a little bit of shame associated with that you didn't uphold your boundaries, but ultimately it's anger. And that's kind of what causes most instances of anger. And there's two directions that people take with anger, at least from an emotional standpoint, from what I've observed. And I'm no psychological expert, therapist, emotional processing guy, brain neuroscientist. I'm none of that shit. I'm a dude who just likes to reason through shit and think out loud as I do these videos. So, emotional processing, you can direct it two ways. You can direct it inward and kind of bury it and have this sentiment that, I hate this person, I don't like this person, fuck this person, they're a terrible person, and you start passing on this judgment, right? And I don't think that's good emotional processing. I feel like that carries a lot of negative energy. And I feel like that doesn't really serve the greater good. Maybe it serves you in that moment because when the infraction happens, you're going to feel those things. But emotions are like waves, right? They come, they go. They come, they go. And if you allow those, if you don't allow those waves to pass, it gets internalized. And in your body, it creates this trauma, and it damages the human spirit. In the other way is that you express it. You can talk to that person, tell them how you made them feel. You can even be dramatic. You can yell, you can shout, I don't want to digress too much, but to me, yelling is not as bad as what people make it. It seems aggressive, and I think we branded it as aggressive. But if we take out that it could lead to the domestic violence portion, I don't think the act of yelling is necessarily a negative thing. You can yell. It may trigger people's trauma, especially ones that have been yelled at as a child that weren't allowed to emotionally process. being yelled at, whatever, right? So you take that risk. That's the consequence, right? If you yell, you may trigger someone's trauma, or you may cross someone's boundaries. They just don't like to be yelled at, right? So there could be a consequence from that. But as far as the emotion in itself, I don't think or the action of yelling in itself is necessarily a bad thing. Go out into the woods and scream, fine. Get it out of your system. Scream into a pillow, whatever you got to do. Just don't infringe on the rights of others. So I'm not really opposed to yelling. You just got to get it out of your system, whether it's journaling, yelling, music, art, whatever. You just got to express it. Allow yourself to process it in the way that feels most like you. And this is where the humanities come from. And why I think the humanities are so damn important is individual expression. And this is one thing that AI can never replace, right? Is expression. The imperfection of the emotion. Emotions aren't logical. They don't have perfection. They're raw. They're unrefined. And that's what makes them so beautiful and so scary, so intimidating, all at once. But this is the human experience. This is the things that make us feel alive. So, the emotional processing externally, I think it's so much better than keeping it inward and feeling this sense of hate. I've had people in my life cross my boundaries, and I've just cut them off. Do I carry ill sentiment? No. I actually still care about those people. I hope them the best. I hope the best for them. I wish them goodwill, and I see some of them as honorless or codeless, or they've broken a code amongst brothers, but, maybe they don't value a code, or maybe they're just trying to find their shit way of living. I don't know, but I don't really carry any ill will. And I suspect it's a larger problem than that individual, which is no one taught them a code of honor or a system or in a sense, a code of conduct, how you behave and how you act. And, the guy on Discord, he said, he finds it very common in people of my psychological type that they often speak of code, they form their own codes, but they're also so guilty of doing things that are worse to others than they ascribe to, and they self-admittedly report such. And I ascribe this to a few things. One is when you're a fucking retarded teenager with the kind of psychological profile that I suppose I have, then naturally, what the hell? This thing is making me go back on the highway. It made me exit, made me go back. It's stupid. Anyway, if you're of my psychological profile, then there's a lot of impulsivity that comes, and you're not thinking through these things. You're acting before you think. And as a teenager, I think this is common among all teenagers, is that a lot of acting and lack of emotional processing. The emotions get too powerful, you act, and then the next thing you know is you hurt somebody or fuck them over or whatever. And of course, I think I felt a lot of shame from that. I still carry a lot of that shame. One of my ex-girlfriends many years ago, I hurt her pretty bad, and I also hurt everyone around her. Not everyone, some of them didn't give a shit, but I caused a lot of damage as a teenager to her interpersonal relationships, to her individually, to her friends, because I was too damn impulsive and I was too overpowered by my damn emotions. And I didn't really have a code at that time. I had a sense of right and wrong that I didn't think about much, but I really didn't have much of a code. I kind of was just trying to get by. And I think that was a big issue. So inevitably, I wound up hurting a bunch of people. And I do want to talk about code because I think not everybody understands what that is. So what is a code? Well, it's a series of principles that say, it could be as simple as the 10 Commandments. These are the things that I follow. This is what makes me behave well, and this is what makes me not behave so well. It could be the Bushido Code, which is obviously not around anymore, but its impacts are still seen and felt. It could be a chivalry code, which I have my arguments against. It could be a martial arts code. Like, part of it was, you know, you don't attack someone first, right? You don't engage in combat first. And we even had this rule called the 3 swing rule, which was someone has to swing at you 3 times before you engage in combat. Now, some of you are like, you're going to really let somebody do that? Because after that 3rd swing, you're going to get knocked the fuck out. The code is actually about trying to avoid the conflict as much as possible. Now, we trained really hard, and most people who swung 3 times really couldn't hit you anyway. Most people aren't very good at combat. And anybody who is good at combat generally shares the same principle, which is like, they're not going to attack you first either. Most martial artists who are at least self-disciplined aren't going to start shit with you either. So it's usually with an untrained person. So in that sense, that code makes sense. And then there's a consequence to that. Anytime I broke the code that I was being taught when I was in my early 20s, there was a consequence. You don't get to train for 3 months. And we had this horse training is what we called it. That the only thing you could practice was the horse stance. That was it. It's a basic Chinese kung fu stance. You weren't allowed to practice anything else. You weren't taught anything. It was like this sense of shame, and that shit hurts. If you stand in a horse stance long enough, that shit really freaking hurts. And we would burn a candle, right? And you had to stay in that damn stance until the candle fully melted. You talk about hell. That's hell. That shit hurts. And you really think about your actions. And you're just like, damn. So you learn this sense of discipline. But do you think my teacher held a grudge because I broke the code? No, he just did exact justice. And it was small infractions on the code, but you learn this discipline, right? So now we're in this society where you infringe on somebody and they carry this vengeance streak. Like, you can't just fight, get over it, and then have a beer and hang out and talk about how stupid you were in that moment and how fucked up you were. That doesn't work. This guy's an idiot. He's literally about to turn left. He's about to turn left in a one-way on the highway. I'm going to wait until he goes. I don't know what the hell he's doing, but he's quite retarded. Okay, he cut across, he did a completely illegal thing there, but anyway. So, back to the code, right? So, yeah, that shit hurt. I'm telling you right now, you really get an opportunity to think about your actions pretty damn quick. And there's not a sense of anything but your own. It's a shame culture, which I've talked about briefly, right? As a culture of shame. And I think shame culture is the way to go. Your community sees you as a dishonorable person, and there's an opportunity to regain your shame. Now, samurai took it to a whole nother level. I mean, seppuku was pretty much the only way to regain your honor, especially if the infraction was significant enough. But regardless, there was an attempt to regain honor. And if you were considered honorless, then your entire family's considered honorless. And that consequence is worse than death, right? They would get the treatment of an honorless scum. And I think that is far more painful than any direct vengeance you can act on that person without harming the innocent. Their peripheral circle, right? So if you want to go kill somebody in an act of vengeance, then yeah, they died. Right? So, okay. But there are things worse than death. So, even from a sense of punishment, this sense of grudges just doesn't make sense to me. So, one thing I mention a lot is about warriors too, right? Like, sorry, it's really a lot of traffic. So, warriors in the warrior code, And if you haven't seen it, you should. The Last Samurai is a dramatized version of Bushido. Yeah, it's a little dramatized, but it's actually a really good movie. It's one of my favorites. I've watched it many times. It's a tearjerker for people who think like me, because I guess it hits me so hard because there's an absence of that today, right? There's this sense of like, there's respect among enemies that is just not present, right? It's like today you hear, oh, fuck that guy, he's a terrible piece of shit person. And back then it was more like this person. As I was saying, Austin's so damn hot that my camera got too hot. And I have AC in here, so that's my point. This shit's too hot. So I was talking about the samurai and warriors in combat, right? So there's a respect amongst enemies, and even those who there's a good movie. It's called Fearless, right? Jet Li. Well, is it really a good movie? I don't know, but there is this scene that really pops out in my head where they wind up switching weapons, and they're in a fight. Jet Li's fighting this guy, and they wind up switching weapons, and Jet Li's happens to be trained in both the sword and the trisectional staff, whereas the guy is only trained in the sword. So Jet Li winds up stopping the fight, flipping the sword around, putting the blade toward himself, and handing the sword over. And the guy wraps up the staff and hands up the staff. Jet Li could have won that easily, right? He could have taken that sword. The guy didn't know what he was doing. You could tell the guy was untrained in the 3-section staff. And Jet Li was fluid with both, but he knew that the guy was at a disadvantage and it'd be a dishonorable victory. And there's this common respect amongst enemies. And even in like today's present society, there's still such thing as a war crime. And I mean, globally, like pretty much there's a consensus that you can wage war, but then there's a war crime, which is a totally different thing. And I think there's this universal understanding and principle that no country is to commit war crimes. So is there a place? Yes. Am I biased? Yes. I'm just one human, right? I don't suspect that I'm right about everything. I think that's important to state, but I feel pretty grounded in that both personal sentiment and codes have their place, but I don't relate to the personal sentiment portion, nor do I find really a value in it at all. And so beyond setting boundaries and being strong in boundaries, I imagine my camera's going to die at some point, so I'm probably going to wrap this up here in a few minutes. But anyway, long story short, this guy had me thinking, right? And he got me thinking about, I think this is the right exit. Yeah. So this guy had me thinking about grudges and how I should there's a place for them. And I'm like, okay, what is that place? And if one of you guys are watching this and you understand that there's a value that having a grudge adds beyond boundaries, I want to hear about it, because I just don't see it. What does a grudge do beyond justice? If you have justice with a code, then what the hell do you need a grudge for? We've evolved into this honorless, guilt-based culture, and I don't really like it. I don't think it's valuable. I think it's separated people. Of course, there's extreme variations of the wrong codes too, which is a whole different debate, I suppose. But what the hell's the point of a grudge? Just get that shit out of your system. Journal, write music, do a screenplay. I mean, I don't care what you do, but I don't fundamentally understand it. And I think that's where my inspiration to do this video comes from, is a lack of understanding. So, aside from that, I think that that's it. I just wanted to share those thoughts and get them off my chest, because he seemed to not get it. More importantly, he tried to say that I should just stop while I'm ahead and just not talk about it. Again, if we can't share ideas and have debate, even about things that may cause you to feel uncomfortable, you have an inability, or I can't speak to this individual. I don't know what he was feeling in that moment, but I think the general consensus is you have an inability to regulate or control your emotions. Therefore, you're just telling people to stop talking, which is an infringement on my right as an individual, right? I don't think he was trying to necessarily shut me up. He was just trying to preserve my reputation. I assume goodwill. It was over text, so it's hard to say for sure. I assume goodwill and good nature, and that saying like, hey, don't embarrass yourself by challenging this. But things should be challenged. And as a friend, not that I know him very well, but if I were a friend to him and he's carrying a grudge and it's affecting him visibly, like this sentiment that I can tell that he's holding, to the point where he can't have a civil conversation with an individual because he hates this person, I would tell him like, dude, this is poison to you. He may be an enemy, but give him a dignified ass kicking to where you exact justice in a way that's calculated and setting a boundary, right? Whether it's to disengage from that individual or have open discourse and own his ass in a debate. Just I don't even know where the grudge started, to be honest, so it's hard to say. I don't know what infringement was happening, disrespect for the individual in itself. I don't really know. But yeah, he really had me thinking, and I think that's a big piece of this. He didn't really want to talk about it. He didn't really want to try to explain it to me. He said it's too long and too complicated for me to understand. And maybe he's right. You know, like maybe it is too complicated for me. As I've gotten older, like I've said before, I've gotten dumber. And my idiocy has led me to ask more questions and state more things. Of course, I'm monologuing here, so there's no one to ask questions to. But this is where my head's at today. You know, there's a lot of things to discuss, but this is one of those things. Anyway, I hope this was informative, valuable, interesting, stupid, entertaining, whatever it was. I hope it added something to you for those who've gotten this far, which you probably didn't. But if you did, thank you. Please like the video, subscribe if you want to hear more ramblings. I'm hoping to get to a point where I'm doing more interviews so we can hear the thoughts of others versus my thoughts. I'm curious to know how many people align with some of the things I'm saying, and then how many people just simply do not align. It makes me very interested. Maybe I'm alone in this. You know, I got really frustrated yesterday because I carry this idea or this notion that what I have to say is no longer relevant in today's culture. What I have to think is no longer relevant. And I don't mean that what I think is wrong. I just mean I don't think anybody gives a shit anymore. I just think that we've moved on. And I'm just an old fuck, crotchety old man who's just bitching about the way things are. But I actually do want things to change. I don't want to just bitch. I want things to change. I want community. I want to see community. Beyond just family. I want to see connected. I want to see shared principles. I'm still very vehemently pro men's groups, pro women's groups, book clubs, whatever creates a shared sense of community and discourse, something you agree with, you don't agree with, and coming up with a series of shared principles that make sense to such group instead of these grudges all the time. Anyway, That's my final message. Got nothing else to say in this moment. Probably will in 5 minutes. Take care. Have a good rest of the day.